Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to Tuesday, and if you can believe it, the 23rd already of June. Unbelievable. Anyhow, I don't know about you, but I can't remember when it has rained that hard and that long around here as it did yesterday and last night for some period of time. What a storm, eh? Well, I hope your basement's not flooded. I have to check mine when I get back home. We'll see what happens. But that was a very strong cell and lasted a long time with really torrential monsoon type rains. So, anyhow, it's past us. Well, good morning again. This is Doug Fagan, your volunteer reader, coming to you from the studios of the Audible Local Ledger here in Deer Crossing of gray, gloomy, post-rain Mashpee, Massachusetts. Today we'll be reading for you the Tuesday, June 23rd edition of the Cape Cod Times. So let's begin with a look at today's weather. Oh boy, that was bad last night. Anyhow, today we're going to have a high of only around 70 degrees. Morning rain, mostly cloudy and a bit humid, but the rain is moving out. Tonight we have a full moon, partly cloudy skies, an overnight low of 61. Tomorrow our temperature soars back up to 77 degrees. Periods of clouds and sunshine, an overnight low of 60. Thursday, mostly sunny, intervals of clouds and sun, a high of 78. And then Friday, we have a high of 77, kind of cloudy with the possibility of some showers. And then Saturday, we get back to Mr. Sunshine again with a high of 82 degrees and an overnight low of 65. So we may be past the worst of it at this particular point and looking for eventually clearing skies and tomorrow warmer with periods of sunshine. Next rain could be possibly Friday when it's going to be cloudy with some showers, but nothing seemingly to worry about. Nothing like we experienced yesterday and last night. Looking at some high temperatures around now, the South Shore and the Cape and Islands, 72 in Plymouth, 67 in Buzzards Bay, 71 in Wareham today. These are highs, folks. Crossing the canal, where a colleague of mine this morning who runs the station here at the Audible Local Ledger, he comes from across the bridge, said there was on the Cape side of the Sagamore Bridge a cistern or pool of water, which he said had to be 3 feet deep, and there was a car stalled in it. So what a mess there on the Sagamore this morning due to that 3 foot deep standing water on the Cape side. Anyhow, hopefully that's cleared out by now. Sandwich will have a high of 70, as will the same be in Mashpee today, 70 degrees, 72 in Falmouth, 70 in Hyannis, 71 in Barnstable, 70 in Dennis, Chatham, Brewster, Eastham, and then a little cooler, 68 in Truro, and 70 degrees out at Race Point in Provincetown. I went to the beach the other day. We're talking now about water temperature. Although I didn't go in, this was last weekend. It's a nice sunny day. There were people who did go in the water. I spoke to one lady. I said, "How was it?" She said it was delightful. That's, of course, after the initial chill of getting in. Anyhow, water temperature. Cape Cod Bay, where it's always colder than the Sound, is 61. Minimal wave heights 1 to 2 feet. Wind direction northwest 7 to 14 knots. Out at Nantucket, water temperature is almost 70 degrees at 69. Wave heights are a little higher, 3 to 5 feet. Wind direction west-southwest 8 to 16 knots. Taking the ferry out to Oak Bluff. Same thing out there in terms of cloudy skies, but the rain has passed. They didn't get as much as we did. It was further north. But on Martha's Vineyard at Oak Bluff, 71, and Edgartown, 70. Out on Nantucket, which may have escaped the rain, at least that according to the radar chart, 69 degrees at Nantucket Village, 68 degrees at Secaucet. All right, there you have it, folks, a kind of bird's eye view of the weather today for the Cape, the South Shore, and Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. All right, stay dry out there, folks. All right, friends, let's move now to page 1 of today's Tuesday, the 23rd of January, Cape Cod Times, see what articles of local or state and regional interest we have, and then we'll move on to national news and international news of interest to us all. The relevant headline here for us Cape Codders on page 1, which is accompanied by an interesting picture, says fired up about history. Underneath that it says tinsmiths, powder horn carving, muskets, and more in Yarmouth's 250-year celebration. This article is by Trebecca Jordan of the Cape Cod Times Network. Underneath the picture, well, before that, the picture has men dressed in colonial military uniforms, very sharp indeed, all holding muskets and firing them. Very nice picture in a cemetery. And it says underneath the picture, members of the Colonel Henry Knox Color Guard give a musket salute near the end of a ceremony at the ancient cemetery. The Legacy of Liberty 250th anniversary celebration was held Saturday of this past week in Yarmouth Port with a living history fair, a ceremony honoring local patriots, and the dedication of a new Revolutionary War monument. And so here, friends, is the accompanying article. Yarmouth marked the 250th anniversary of the American independence with its Legacy of Liberty celebration Saturday, with a living history fair, a ceremony honoring local patriots, and the dedication of a new Revolutionary War monument. At the Living History Fair, John Garcia, a Yarmouth historian, demonstrated tinsmithing and emphasized the importance of understanding the past. Those that don't know the history are doomed to repeat it, Garcia said. Well, that sounds familiar from someplace. Well, we've had so many families with children who are coming and learning about what it was like in the past, and hopefully it will help them and guide them in their futures. In 2020, historians in Dennis and Yarmouth began researching the town's service in the Revolutionary War. Using historical records, muster rolls, and other documents, they identified 447 men who served, representing nearly 70% of Yarmouth's male population at that time. The findings helped inspire the creation of a public monument honoring Yarmouth's Revolutionary War veterans and their families, commissioned from Boston sculptor Robert Shore. The monument is dedicated to the brave patriots who served from our town, as well as their families who stayed behind to take care of life while these men went off and fought, said Susan Flack, volunteer project manager for Yarmouth's Legacy of Liberty event. The monument was unveiled at Fred Thatcher Park during a 10 a.m. ceremony. A brass sculpture at the top of the monument shows a man, his wife, and a baby near a plow where he put his coat down, indicating that he was going off to fight and pursue the revolution, Flack said. His wife and child are there because they were part of the history as well, she said. Of the 447 men who served in the war from the town, 53 are buried in the ancient cemetery. The Living History Fair ran from 11 in the morning till 3 p.m. in the afternoon. The event featured culinaria craft demonstrations, including a candle maker, potter, printer, powder horn carver, spinner sand, and stone cutter. Colonial-era games were also played, along with a weapons display. Yarmouth joins a handful of other Cape Cod towns, such as Brewster and Dennis, that have celebrated the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution with day-long community fairs, encampments, and assorted ceremonies. Laurie McCarthy, a Yarmouth Port historian, displayed colonial-era powder horns and explained that the cow horns were used by soldiers during the Revolutionary War to carry gunpowder and thus keep it dry. While people sat in their free time, they might carve designs into them, McCarthy said, pointing to a powder horn engraved with a map. They're like visual diaries from these soldiers. Today, historians can often date powder horns to specific periods based on their carvings and designs. All right, there you have it, a brief reference to the celebration held in the Yarmouth Dennis area this past Saturday, honoring those from that area who served in the Revolutionary War, 447 of them. Well, turning down to the Cape and Islands page, we have one article, a very brief one from relevant to the Cape, and amidst multiple myriad articles about advertisements and a huge picture. But I'll share this article with you, which says, Provincetown played a role in the little-known Boston Tea Party tempest. This is by George Costinas of the Cape Cod Times Network. Here's the article. The coastline at Race Point in Provincetown is rather secluded and peacefully barren, and looks pretty much the way it did in colonial times when Cape Cod added a little-known chapter to the story of the Boston Tea Party. On the morning of December 11th, 1773, a British ship, the William, ran aground in a storm on a sandbar along the shoreline near Race Point. Heading for Boston, the William carried a cargo of 58 chests of tea, upon which the British government had imposed a tax that was quite repugnant to the still British subjects of what was then officially called the province of Massachusetts Bay. In addition, the ship, the William, carried 300 street lamps to, for the first time, light up the streets of Boston. The William was one of 4 ships carrying the taxed tea to Boston. The 3 other ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, made it safely to Boston. The British government had already passed a number of acts taxing various goods, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts, to name a few, which included the tax on tea. Later, after much protest by the colonists, most of those acts were repealed, but not the tax on tea. Historian Ron Peterson tells the story of the wreck of the William and the controversy over the tea it carried in his essay, The Boston Tea Party and the Wreck of the William, a link to Cape Cod. Part of the book, released in 2025, entitled The Revolution on Cape Cod and the Islands, Issues, Events, and People. Peterson writes in his essay that, quote, the fuse was lit on May 10, 1773, when the king affirmed the Tea Act, end quote. The colonists responded with a boycott of the taxed tea. So a surprising windfall lands on Cape Cod as a sentence that leads us into our next paragraph. David Martin, chairman of the Cape Cod and Islands Historians Committee, said much controversy surrounded the tea from the William, which was due to the idea that the colonists were not yet committed to the Revolution. At that time, they were protesting for their rights as British citizens. Loyalists complained, too. They didn't like the tax on tea either. They said the taxes were too high. So there were a lot of conflicting feelings all around, said Martin in a telephone interview with the Times. It's a perfect example of the dilemma faced when there is not unanimity about what you should be doing. Unexpectedly, the tea fell into their hands. There were 4 options. You could drink it, destroy it, sell it, or give it back. The incident reveals the unique place that Cape Cod had in the colony's response to the Tea Act. There was no other place where there was unfaxed tea and where they were allowed to debate about it, said Peterson in a telephone interview. It was a microcosm of showing how things were resolved and what people were thinking. Then 5 days after the William ran aground, on the night of December 16, 1773, 340 chests of tea belonging to the British East India Tea Company were seized from the 3 ships that made it to Boston and were thus thrown into Boston Harbor by men disguised as Native Americans. So a tea controversy keeps brewing. Well, the Boston Tea Party was essentially a protest in response to what the people of Boston felt was a violation of their rights as citizens of Great Britain, that according to the British Constitution. In addition to the 4 ships scheduled to bring the taxed tea to Boston, 3 other ships sailed to Charleston, Philadelphia, and New York. In contrast to the actions of the Bostonians, it was decided that the tea from the 3 ships would be sent back, and Peterson, in a telephone interview, said such. In Boston, he said the colonists attempted to work with the British ship captains and Governor Thomas Hutchinson to send the tea back. But when Hutchinson refused, they went to Plan B and thus tossed the tea into the sea, in what became known, as we all know, as the Boston Tea Party. Unlike the impression often given that it was a wild night of destruction and mayhem, it was, in fact, Peterson said, a very well-planned and very disciplined act of protest. No damage was done to any of the ships or any other cargo, he said. In fact, a lock was broken and it was replaced. This was not a spur-of-the-moment mob action. It was this attitude that, perhaps in part, ignited the controversy regarding the tea carried by the William. So the tradition of salvage leads us into this next paragraph, which says, when the ship ran aground, Jonathan Clark, owner of the William, traveled 119 miles from Castle Island to Provincetown to salvage the tea, according to Peterson's essay. He was joined by John Greenough of Wellfleet, who was engaged in various occupations and was known to have done some business with Clark, and may have even been related to him. Mr. Greenough was in the business of salvaging shipwrecks, which were a quite common occurrence in and around Cape Cod in those times. Initially, Greenough and Clark hired residents of Provincetown to remove the tea and the street lamps from the William for storage until the ship could be repaired and then sent on to Boston. But a few days later, the William was completely destroyed by yet another storm. Greenough and others in Provincetown, tradition determined that what was salvaged was then fair game, Peterson said. For the most part, they kept what they salvaged. 55 of the 58 chests of tea were saved from the wreckage of the William, but were not destroyed. The workers who brought the tea ashore were paid with some of the tea, Peterson wrote. A captain from Salem inadvertently ships the tea. Well, but the ship captains in Provincetown, in compliance with the boycott on the tea, refused to use their vessels to transport the tea. By chance, Clark found Captain John Cook of Salem, who had happened to have anchored his ship, the Eunice, in Provincetown to avoid a storm, to thus then transport the tea to Boston. Interestingly, the 300 street lamps made it to Boston, transported by the same Provincetown ship captains who refused to take the taxed tea. The lamps were meant for Boston and were not taxed, so it was okay to transport them, but not the cursed tea, as they referred to it, he said. However, Cook ended up taking 51 of the chests of that tea to Boston. In his essay, Peterson wrote that Cook and the owner of the Eunice were angrily confronted by the people of Salem for having transported the tea out, and at a town meeting held both men blameless, but the tea was transported rather out of ignorance. Similarly, when people of Boston discovered what happened, they were angry at Clark, who did not destroy the tea, and Greenough, who managed to obtain a good portion of the other 4 chests that did not make it to Boston. Hardliners among the Patriots believed that the tea should have been destroyed, as it was done in Boston. Greenough, the Wellfleet tea seller. Well, Greenough and others felt the tea, since it was not taxed, could then be sold. However, much of the tea that Greenough sold was confiscated and thus eventually destroyed. Stephen Atwood bought 1 chest, and his house was searched by a group of citizens who took what he had and then burned it in public. Brentwood had already sold a good portion of what he received from Greenough, and that some of it may have ended up in Lyme, Connecticut. Colonel Knowles of Eastham. Well, let's see about Colonel Knowles. Greenough also sold 190 pounds of tea to Colonel William Knowles of Eastham. That seems to be quite a bit of tea, but it was considerably smaller than the 9,650 pounds that were dumped into Boston Harbor. No matter, the Patriots were not going to overlook it. Knowles also was accosted and was threatened with having his hands and face tarred and feathered, wrote Peterson in his essay. But after further investigation, the town voted that the buying and selling of untaxed tea should not be interpreted as endorsing the Tea Act or the right of Parliament to tax America, he wrote. So Greenough, although known to be a patriot, came under significant scrutiny for selling the tea he had obtained. What Greenough had left of the tea was impounded eventually. Like Knowles, he was confronted, though not as severely, and he argued that since he obtained and sold untaxed tea, he was not violating the spirit of the protest of the boycott. Eventually, the town of Wellfleet returned the tea to Greenough, whereupon, by May, he had sold it all. So the wreck of the HMS Somerset. Well, there's an interesting irony in Greenough's story. In 1778, the British warship, the HMS Somerset, was wrecked in a storm in almost the same spot as the William, where it ran aground. Greenough, with his experience in salvage, was charged with overseeing the removal and dispersal of the Somerset's contents, that, according to, again, Peterson's essay. In the true tradition of salvage, it was guns and ammunition and cannon that were taken for the Revolution Army to use. It was an act of war, Peterson said. Greenough's reputation as a patriot was thus then solidified. The final outcome of what happened with the towns on the Outer Cape was that the people had different ideas, different opinions, but they were able to come together not only about the tea, but about the commitment to the revolution. All right, an interesting reference to folks and their opinions on taxed tea back in the day. Well, friends, for this particular paper, at least as far as I can see at this point, those are the articles that are relevant to the Cape and to Massachusetts in general. But this next article has relevance for the entire U.S., and the headline here says, graduations grow contentious in the United States. Unapproved messages, artificial intelligence have caused disputes. This is a USA Today article, and there's a picture of a graduation ceremony. Underneath the picture, it says school officials who interrupt or cut off the mics of speakers for delivering unapproved messages can end up amplifying those messages even more. Here's the article. As graduation season in the United States draws to a close, the last few moments of school for some recent high school and college graduates were marred by controversy. Graduation ceremonies around the country in recent weeks have made headlines for student valedictorians being cut off mid-sentence, guest speakers facing boos from audiences of students, and even an allegation of racist speech. Incidents happened in Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, as well as in other states. On June 14, some graduate students at Stanford University walked out during a keynote address by Google CEO Sundar Pichai in protest of the company's ties to Israel, so reported by the BBC. In North Carolina, one high school graduation video went viral after a valedictorian went off script to deliver a message to her classmates about using their voices to speak out about issues, including immigration enforcement. She was interrupted and guided away from the microphone. Evidently not free speech happening there. We're not given a voice to stay silent, said Clayton High School valedictorian Leen Hijaz the moment before her remarks were cut short. School officials who interrupt or cut off the mics of speakers for delivering so-called unapproved messages can actually end up amplifying those messages even more. Videos of incidents this graduation season were widely shared on social media, turning the graduation controversies into national news. The outrage is usually the result of the response, not necessarily the thing that required schools to respond in the first place, said Lisa Abramson, a higher education consultant who handles public relations crises for school. So, artificial intelligence mentions are booed. At multiple college graduation ceremonies around the country, graduates and audience members were seen and heard booing and jeering various speeches. The topic that often struck a chord with students this year, artificial intelligence. Real estate development executive Gloria Caulfield was booed at the University of Central Florida after she called AI's rise to the next quote, the next industrial revolution. AI sucks, a voice in the audience yelled in a video of the ceremony as the crowd booed her references to artificial intelligence. At Middle Tennessee State University, Big Machine Records CEO Scott Borchetta was booed while talking about AI at the commencement ceremony for the school's College of Media and Entertainment, which is named after him, reported the Nashville Tennessean, part of the USA Today network. Streaming rewrote the economics, social media rewrote the discovery of model, and AI is rewriting production as we sit here, he said. When the crowd started booing, he pushed back. I know it. Deal with it. Like I said, it's a tool. Still was not accepted by the audience. At Glendale Community College in Arizona, AI was booed for another reason. The school used AI software to announce graduates' names as they received their diplomas, but the software botched or skipped hundreds of names, the Arizona Republic reported. Today's college students have mixed feelings about AI, said Fabrizio Cariani, a professor and chair of the philosophy department at the University of Maryland, who teaches a class called AI and the Human Experience. Some embrace it, while others worry about its impact on their professional job markets and to face threats of discipline for using it in school. So anti-Semitism allegations, One high school graduation in North Carolina was the subject of controversy when a valedictorian speech was perceived as being racist by a racist dog whistle, that is, by many, as reported by the Wilmington Star News. At the Haggard High School's graduation ceremony in Wilmington, North Carolina, Victorian Kyler William Hasek ended his speech with a quote, which was, as my biggest inspiration once said, every human being has something of value that they bring to the table, end quote. Some fellow students recognized that the quote was similar to one by Ye, that's Y-E, the rapper, formerly known as Kanye West, in an interview laden with anti-Semitic comments years ago. One classmate, Sarah Rudsiel, grabbed the mic when it was time to receive her diploma to call it out and was cut off while speaking. Other students were also outraged, Rudisiel said. Hasek later told the news outlet W-Way that he rejects anti-Semitism and asked people to view his speech in its entirety. My speech was about hope and optimism, Hasek told the outlet. As my classmates and I start a new chapter in our lives, I wanted to encourage them to remember that every person has value and that we all have the ability to make a positive difference in the lives of ourselves and others. I want to be clear that I reject anti-Semitism and hatred in all forms. So shutting off microphones, that's kind of a new option, it seems. In numerous cases in recent years, when a student speaker touches on topics perceived as political or controversial, many school officials have shut off their microphones. interrupted them, or even withheld diplomas. But their actions tend to draw even more negative attention to the messages they tried to cut off, experts have said. One college sought to prevent controversial remarks from happening altogether in 2026. New York University told its student speakers at certain school-specific ceremonies that their speeches would be pre-recorded and played during the graduation rather than being delivered live, reported independent student newspaper Washington Square News. That move came a year after a speaker delivered a pro-Palestinian message during the NYU graduation. Student speakers don't generally have a right to free speech when it comes to delivering addresses at commencement, but schools should have an interest in fostering the expression of students' ideas, said Stanford Ungar, the director of Georgetown University's Free Speech Project. No one has a right to speak at any graduation, but it's going to be a sad thing if it turns out that the only subject that is acceptable to talk about at graduation is the lovely weather, Ungar said in a 2024 interview. All right, there you have it, with all the controversy and the division in the country and all the craziness that's going on, not only in our country, but around the world, some of which is fostered by our country. There's a lot of different opinions among graduates, and I guess they've decided that maybe their graduation ceremony is a pertinent realm in which they can express their views. All right, we are now moving on. Well, friends, there are no obituaries, which is typically right now at a midpoint time in our broadcast that we relay such information, but for whatever reasons, there are none displayed in today's paper, so we'll continue along with news of a national and international interest. This next headline says, Judge shuts down probe into Minnesota officials. The ruling finds Justice Department investigation coercive. This is a Reuters news agency article with a dateline of Washington, D.C., and here is the article. A judge found that the Trump administration unlawfully demanded information from several Minnesota officials at the height of its immigration crackdown in the state earlier this year, ruling that the Justice Department had abused the investigative process. The ruling by Minnesota-based U.S. District Judge Patrick Schlitz quashed subpoenas to the office of the state's Democratic Governor Tim Walz and 5 other local and state officials, according to an order made public on June 22nd. It effectively halts a probe by President Trump's Justice Department into whether Democratic officials had impeded immigration enforcement in their public resistance to the deployment of thousands of agents to conduct deportation roundup. Schlitz, as a judge, is an appointee of Republican President George W. Bush, and he wrote that the Justice Department's legal justification for the investigation was risible, R-I-S-I-B-L-E. The court finds that the dominant purpose of the challenged subpoenas is to coerce Minnesota officials into assisting the federal government with enforcing civil immigration law and to harass and retaliate against them for failing to do so, Judge Schlitz wrote. The order issued on June 17th was unsealed on June 22nd. A Justice Department spokesperson said the department, quote, takes the unlawful obstruction of federal law enforcement operations extremely seriously and will continue to act in full compliance with the law to investigate these matters, end quote. The immigration surge led to numerous violent confrontations with residents and activists in the Minneapolis area, including the killings of 2 U.S. citizens by federal agents in January. The ruling is the latest to find that the Trump Justice Department conducted a politically motivated investigation aimed more at harassing opponents than examining potential crimes. A judge in Washington, D.C. made a similar finding in holding a probe into then Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell this past March. The Justice Department sought a wide range of information on state and local policies and directives related to a federal immigration operation. The subpoena recipients included Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey and Governor Walz, whom Trump has frequently derided and who served as Democrat Kamala Harris's vice presidential nominee this past 2024. Governor Walz said in a statement that the decision was a victory for the rule of law and our democracy. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, a Democrat whose office was also subpoenaed, applauded the ruling. In America, we settle our political differences at the ballot box, and it should disturb every American that Trump is weaponizing the criminal justice system against people he disagrees with, he said in a statement. The Justice Department issued the subpoenas in January as Trump and administration officials accused Walz and other officials of deliberately stoking interference with immigration and customs enforcement operations in the state of Minnesota. Walz openly encouraged citizens to record video of ICE arrests and lauded protesters opposed to the Trump administration's crackdown. Department of Justice lawyers said the investigation was focused on whether state and local officials had violated laws barring obstruction of federal operations and harbored migrants living illegally in the United States. Recipients challenged the subpoenas in court, arguing they were issued for the improper purpose of retaliating against political opponents and coercing cooperation with the federal government. Judge Schlitz found that the DOJ put forward little evidence that state and local officials had violated any laws whatsoever. That fact, and the fact that connections between the information sought in the subpoenas and any possible criminal violations ranged from extremely weak to non-existent, only added to the overwhelming evidence that these subpoenas were not issued to investigate, but rather to harass, coerce, and retaliate. So wrote Judge Schlitz. All right, friends, at this point, let's divert from the news of the day and take a look at the lottery, starting first, as we always do, with the Mega Millions and the Powerball, the two big ones. First of all, the Mega Millions has an existing jackpot of $467 million. How would you like to win that? Of course, the cash value, if you take that in one lump sum, is less than half of that value. It is $211 million. My, what a pittance. How could you deal with just $211 million? And what, pray tell, would you spend it on? Nice to think about it, however. All right, winning numbers most recently, which were drawn this past Friday, the 19th of June, for the Mega Millions were these: 13, 16, 21, 26, and 50, with a Mega Ball of 12. Again, 13, 16, 21, 26, 50, and a Mega Ball of 12. Moving to Powerball, the next drawing will be held tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Reverting back to Mega Millions, the next drawing will be today at 11 tonight. So, Powerball, $327 million is the jackpot. Estimated cash value, $148 million. The most recent winning numbers drawn for Powerball were drawn yesterday, the 22nd of June, and here they are: 17, 19, 21, 45, 48, and a Powerball of 13. 17, 19, 21, 45, 48, and a Powerball of 13. All right, moving on to Millionaire for Life, which provides $1 million a year for the duration of your life, obviously. Those winning numbers were drawn yesterday, on Monday as well, June 22nd. Here are those winning numbers for the Millionaire for Life: 7, 8, 20, 24, 42, and a Millionaire for Life ball of 5. 7, 8, 20, 24, 20, 42, I'll repeat that. 7, 8, 20, 24, 42, and a Millionaire for Life ball of 5. Mega Bucks, $21.5 million in the jackpot. Here are those winning numbers again from yesterday: 6, 8, 9, 12, 15, 17. 6, 8, 9, 12, 15, 17. All right. How about we take a look at the numbers game? The midday numbers game from yesterday. Here are those winning numbers. 1778. 1778 for the midday, and the evening drawing in the numbers game 0121. 0121 for the numbers game. And finally, for Mass Cash, $100,000 top prize, the midday drawing numbers, winning numbers from yesterday. Monday were these: 10, 14, 17, 27, and 29. 10, 14, 17, 27, 29 for the midday Mass Cash. And the evening for Mass Cash numbers were these: 2, 11, 31, 33, 35. 2, 11, 31, 33, 35 for Mass Cash. All right, that's a quick look at the various winning numbers most recently for the various lottery games. And again, you can't win if you don't play, but that's pretty much whatever you want to do. Totally up to you. But for those of you who do decide to play, I say to you, as I always do, good luck, players. All right, now we're going to move on with some other news at this point. This next article deals with technology. It says the House committee reaches deal on social media rules for youth. This is a Reuters news agency article with the dateline of Washington, D.C., and here's the article. U.S. House Energy and Commerce Committee leadership agreed on legislation that would require social media platforms to provide safeguards and tools for minors and parents. That, according to a statement on Monday, June 22nd, which was a key step in a years-long debate over how to protect children online. Chairman Brett Guthrie and top committee Democrat Frank Pallone declined to release more specific details about the agreement, but did say it would hold big tech accountable. We worked across the aisle for many months and have now found common ground on policies to significantly improve the digital environment for kids, Guthrie and Pallone said in a joint statement. Tech companies are under increasing scrutiny in the United States for their effect on youth, with parents and state officials pushing to ban phones from schools to limit access. The agreement does not include a, quote, duty care, end quote, provision, the spokesman for committee Republicans said. Such language will require companies to design social media platforms with children's safety in mind. The House agreement faces several hurdles before becoming law, including winning support in the Senate and from President Trump. The White House press office did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Speaker Mike Johnson of the House, the top Republican in the House, supports the agreement according to a source familiar with his thinking. House Democrats have long demanded that the duty of care provision be included in any children's online safety legislation, complicating the bill's path forward at this point. At the national level, U.S. lawmakers for years have declined to pass comprehensive legislation regulating social media, prompting states to pass their own laws. At least 20 states have enacted laws, at least as early as last year, addressing social media use by children, that according to the Nonpartisan National Conference of State Legislatures, an organization that tracks state bills. Reuters news agency previously reported that Meta Platforms, which owns Instagram and Facebook, lobbied Congress for legal immunity from child harm claims tied to social media projects. Meta, Google's YouTube, TikTok, and Snap are facing thousands of lawsuits accusing them of designing social media platforms that are indeed harmful to young people. If such a provision became law, it could undermine those cases. Asked about the lobbying effort and the proposed language, Meta spokesperson Stephanie Otway said the provision does not extinguish existing lawsuits, nor does it represent blanket immunity. Meta and YouTube face a combined $6 million in damages after they lost the first case at trial in California earlier this year. All right, That concludes that particular article on social media apps for youth and efforts to provide safety for young people in using the internet. Here's an interesting article relative to sports and concerning Dusty May, the very successful coach at the University of Michigan basketball. The headline says, May leaves the Wolverines for the NBA's Mavericks. This is from the Detroit Free Press. Here's the article. The savior of Michigan basketball is gone. Dusty May, the coach who turned the Wolverines around in 1 year and elevated the program to the highest pedal in the sport in his second year, has left for the National Basketball Association to take a job with the Dallas Mavericks, so confirmed by the Detroit Free Press. The Mavs hired Toronto Raptors executive Masai Ujiri as team president after the 2025-26 season, and then parted with head coach Jason Kidd on May 19. They reportedly had talks with May and Duke coach Jon Scheyer over this past month. The Mavs went 26-56 last season, but have NBA Rookie of the Year Cooper Flagg as their building block. They have the number 9 pick in the NBA draft on Tuesday night, a spot potentially for Michigan center Andy Mara or All-American forward Yaxel Lendeborg to land. May, age 49, went 64-13 in 2 years at the Michigan campus, and while his stay was shorter than UM certainly hoped, it brought with it some of the most tremendous highs in more than 100 years of the team's existence, that among what some feel is a corrupt overall athletic department after many scandals of recent years. The Wolverines, however, are working toward hiring assistant coach Mike Boynton Jr. as interim head coach, the Detroit Free Press confirmed with a person inside the university. Dusty May follows ex-Michigan coach John Beilein as the last college coach to jump to the NBA. Beilein was fired from the Cleveland Cavaliers after 54 games of his first season of the 2019-2020 year. He then joined the Pistons staff. In 24-25, May, hired from Florida Atlantic University, revamped the Michigan roster in 6 weeks with key transfers. Behind Danny Wolf, Vlad Golden, and Trey Donaldson, Michigan outperformed expectations, finished second in the Big Ten, and advanced to the Sweet 16 of the NCAA tournament after having missed the postseason in 2 previous seasons. Of course, that paled in comparison to what Michigan accomplished in this most recent 25-26 year. May landed Yaxel Lendeborg from University of Alabama, Birmingham, Morez Johnson Jr. from Illinois, Ade Mara from UCLA, and Elliot Cadeau from North Carolina from the transfer portal. He had then added McDonald's All-American Trey McKinney and kept 4 key players intact from the prior season in Amari Burnett, Roddy Gale Jr., L.J. Kissan, and Will Shedder. Together, it proved far and away the greatest UM team of all time. It set a program record for wins of 37 in 2 years, a Big Ten record in wins, 19, and became the first team to sweep the league road games, going 10-0 in 50 years, and topped it all off with a dominant NCAA tournament, winning 6 games by an average of 19 points en route to the second national championship in program history. Much of that team left either due to eligibility or early for the NBA, yet still May reloaded this spring, bringing in a trio of proven transfers and Jalen Reed from LSU to pair with a proven backcourt of Cadeau and McKinney. He landed top 5 freshman class in the nation, led by McDonald's All-Americans Brandon McCoy and Quinn Costello. He supplemented them with high upside versatile players in Joseph Hartman, Malachi Brown, Marcus Moeller, and Lincoln Cosby. May seemingly could have stayed in Ann Arbor and built a behemoth, but as one of the most desired names across the sport at any level in the world, The chance to lead one of the 30 NBA franchises was an opportunity that was too appealing to pass up. May is a grinder, having gone from student manager to graduate assistant to video coordinator to assistant coach, and then to high major assistant coach to mid-major head coach, and finally the head coach at Michigan as one of the top basketball conferences in the nation. Growing up in eastern Greene, Indiana, May's dream was to be a history teacher and a high school coach. Instead, he had too much drive, talent, and passion, and that helped him climb the ranks to become one of the most coveted minds in the sport of basketball. It leaves a massive hole in Ann Arbor, one that won't be filled easily. It will sting for some time for the fans, knowing no matter who is brought in, it will be near impossible to fill the shoes of Dusty May. Then again, few people, if any, even May and Athletic Director Ward Manuel, admitted they didn't expect immediate success to the extent they had. None of them would have thought what happened the past 2 years was even possible under May. All right, there you have it. Renowned head basketball coach at the University of Michigan and very successful coach Dusty May is off to greener pastures of the NBA as head coach of the struggling Dallas Mavericks. Staying now a bit longer in sports and taking a look at the professional baseball standings, which many in this area do not really want to look at. Looking first at this division, where your beloved Boston Red Sox are currently in last place, and if you can believe this, with a record of 31 wins and 45 losses, they are currently 14 and one-half games behind their hated rival, the New York Yankees. Tampa Bay is in second place in the Eastern Division, only 2 games behind the Yankees. Toronto, Baltimore, and Boston seem at this point to be basically out of the race. In the Central Division, the Chicago White Sox and the Cleveland Guardians are basically tied for first place, with the Minnesota Twins 3.5 games behind. In the West, Seattle leads the Oakland A's by 1.5 games, as well as the Texas Rangers by 1.5, who are tied for second with the Athletics. In the National League, in the Eastern Division, Atlanta leads Philadelphia by 6.5 games. Milwaukee in the Central Division leads St. Louis by 5. And in the West, the perennial favorites and champion Los Angeles Dodgers, with a record of 50 wins and 29 losses, are in first place, leading one-time division leader, the San Diego Padres, at this point by 9 games. All right, there you have it. A look at the Major League standings. Staying with baseball, the College World Series, which is always fun to watch. In Game 1, Oklahoma beat North Carolina 9-3. North Carolina then beat Oklahoma in Game 2 6-2. And in Game 3 of the best of 3, Oklahoma beat North Carolina again for their second win of the 3 to win that series 13-2. Since we're looking at various rankings, I see here on this page there's a statement about the World Golf Rankings. I'll give you the top 10 right now, just for fun. Scotty Scheffler leads the World Golf Rankings. He's in first place. Rory McIlroy is second. Cameron Young third. Matt Fitzpatrick fourth. Russell Henley fifth. Tommy Fleetwood sixth. Justin Rose 7. John Rahm 8. J.J. Spawn 9, and Colin Morikawa is 10. Those are your top 10 in world professional golf. And in another reference to baseball, be informed, please, as many of you may already know, that the Cape Cod Baseball League has begun. It will run from this point, which started this past week, through August. Part of August anyhow, until their playoffs begin. It's really high-quality college baseball, considered by many to be the top college summer league in the United States. And if you have a chance to get out and see one of those games, please do so. 8 parks around the Cape, all free admission. Of course, they look for a donation of some sort. And some of the concessions are really good as well, along with high quality baseball. So if you get a chance, go out and support the Cape Cod Baseball League. Well, back to the news of the day. As you well know, the reflecting pool at Washington, D.C. has become a center of controversy, and the failure for it to be cleaned up is attracting national news. This next headline says firm was given a no-bid reflecting pool contract. This is a USA Today Network article, so we'll see what it says. Here it is. The business was given a no-bid contract to install a water purification system in the Lincoln Memorial Reflecting Pool and is tied to a man who is a donor and Palm Beach neighbor of President Donald Trump, that according to the New York Times and other media outlets. So the reflecting pool, a centerpiece of Trump's highly touted District of Columbia makeover, has turned into a spectacle of green water, peeling blue coating, and political blame shifting. Roughly 2 weeks after a $14 to $15 million renovation and the American flag blue repainting of the bottom, a massive algae bloom has turned the water lime green, while the new surface flakes off in visible sheets. National Park Service officials and scientists say the algae is a predictable result of summer heat, shallow, stagnant water, and nutrient-rich runoff, and are treating it with hydrogen peroxide and nanobubble aeration as what they describe as being safe. Trump, of course, blamed vandalism, claiming vandals used chemicals to damage the pool, even as federal workers acknowledge the new coating is separated from the concrete below the surface well on its own. The water purification system was installed by Green Water Services, an Ohio firm owned through the J.J. Cafaro Investment Trust, controlled by longtime Trump friend and donor John J. Cafaro. The New York Times has reported this. The Times added the contract bypassed a competitive bidding process typically required and gave $1.7 million in contract to the Green Water Services firm. According to the Palm Beach Daily News, Cafaro bought the house about a mile north of Trump's Mar-a-Lago for $16 million through a trust in his name in 2007. His wife, Janet, now owns it in a trust in her name. In February, the Palm Beach Town Council approved a variance to allow a cabana to be built on the oceanside slip of land that is part of the Cafaro estate, which includes a 1928 house known through the years as Nuestro Paradiso and Casa Alegre. The estate, with its Mediterranean revival mansion designed by architect Julius Jacob, received Palm Beach approval as a landmark in 1991. Town records show the 1.5-acre property has a 150-foot-long stretch of beachfront. In a Truth Social post on June 20th, Trump said the reflecting pool probably needs to be drained to make additional repairs, a move he blamed on terrible vandals, many of whom he said had been arrested, although no arrest reports had been reported at the time of his statement. After meeting with contractors, the president said the pool, which had worked perfectly, had been severely damaged by corrosive and destructive chemicals poured into it, in addition to a gash in its surface. All right, there you have it, the article about the current status of the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C., and the mess caused by algae and whatever else may be the problems relative to the renovation. All right, friends, that brings us to the conclusion of today's broadcast of the Tuesday, June 23rd edition of the Cape Cod Times. For those of you who are fathers out there listening to our broadcast, I hope you had a wonderful Father's Day and enjoyed the company or the conversation or communication with your family members who I'm sure appreciate you as well. So until next Tuesday when we meet again and I can talk with you, I will say goodbye for now, thanking you for the privilege of your time. It's been my pleasure to read for you today, and I wish you a happy and healthy week, and so long for now.